Hello, my name is Jason Persoff. I'm an Assistant Director of Emergency Preparedness at the University of Colorado Hospital, and I'm also a valued member of the Region 8 Mountain Plains Regional Disaster Health Response System. And today, we're going to talk about disasters. And a recent movie title sort of sums up the approach to disasters everywhere, which is it's everything everywhere all at once. Let me briefly go through the agenda today. We're going to talk about what a disaster is, because in order for us to actually measure and approach a topic, we need to understand what it is we're talking about. We'll talk about the emergency preparedness cycle, expanding incidents, and the incident command system, with suggestions for further training at the end of this presentation. I have no financial disclosures, and I would definitely welcome them, but I don't think there's really a lot of industry that has a lot of financial backing within disasters. By their very nature, they're kind of costly. We'll go ahead and get started. So fundamentally, it's good to understand what we mean when we talk about disasters. Disasters are referred to as hazards. The most common of these is the focal no-notice mass casualty event. Plane crashes, accidents, active shooter situations, and events that lead to an acute mass casualty event that then leads to a rapid surge of patients, but usually over a short period of time that may only fundamentally interrupt operations for a few hours to a day. More recently, we all experienced a widespread mass effect incident, something that lasts days to years and can include assaults by nature, such as hurricanes and tornadoes, or by man, such as bioterrorism with a dirty bomb. Pandemics and infrastructure failures, such as needing to evacuate a hospital, are mass effect incidents. Crippling cyber attacks are also on the rise against healthcare targets, and mass effect incidents are considered sustained and strained events and lead to upheavals in organizations' routine operations. When a medical hazard occurs, this can lead to a patient surge. Patient surge is defined as the capacity of a system to care for all its patients, and experience from prior events suggests that most hospitals can tolerate a mass casualty event that results in 20% higher than normal volume of acute patients in a short period of time. However, if this is sustained or the number of casualties are too numerous, this will lead to a supply-demand mismatch. Here, most organizations will rapidly develop issues involving the 4 S's of emergency response. Those are staff, space, supplies, and systems. So, for example, we may not have enough staff to care for patients, or insufficient supplies to deal with the crisis on hand, inadequate space to place those patients. You can't turn every area into a patient care space, for example. How would you route the oxygen or the monitoring equipment? And it can also lead to disruptions in normal referral patterns or supply chains that threaten the ability to care for patients. In its most extreme form, this can result in governors declaring crisis standards of care, a psychologically distressing situation where the best care that can be provided for the highest number of individuals trumps the usual standard of care and can result in allocation of resources to those most likely to benefit instead of necessarily to all patients. A mass effect incident can also lead to the inability to usher patients through a system, such as what we saw during the Delta wave of COVID at the end of 2021. There were high numbers of patients who continued to fill hospital beds while the acute demand did not diminish and filled our emergency departments. Some states, including Colorado and New Mexico, invoked aspects of their crisis standards of care plans to deal with disaster. These are some good references that can help you understand these topics a little bit more in depth. So regardless of whether a hazard is a no-notice or sustained event, all emergency preparedness focuses on what's called an all hazards approach. This approach that means that most organizations must be able to match calamity with, or match unknown calamities, I should say, with structured and effective responses. The process for developing an effective plan is known as emergency preparedness, and it follows a cycle that is often driven by painful experience, though that not necessarily need to be the case. In an ideal state, preparedness develops on early warning indicators so that hospitals can begin planning for disaster. For example, as I'm talking right now, there's an outbreak of Marburg in Equatorial Guinea that may prompt planning on the use of biocontainment procedures, personnel, and protocols. Regardless of the cause, though, a hazard will inevitably arise that results in the need for disaster response. This is perhaps the most titillating portion of emergency preparedness, as it often dominates everyone's efforts and has a tangible effect on operations. One of the least properly prepared for or initiated phases comes into play near the end of an event, and that is demobilization. Much like discharging patients, this should start on day one to understand what criteria or goals will be needed to enter the recovery phase of a disaster. As the immediacy of the disaster resolves, focus shifts to mitigation. Mitigation starts with a thorough after-action review, or AAR, that applauds what went well, but also takes an honest look at things that need improving. This is where high-performing institutions place their emphasis and their money, but many won't, since this phase is one where financial commitments and training are often needed to round out the response. Preparations for the next disaster or the next time that will occur, well, that's just not as high a priority. That said, there becomes decreasing interest and emphasis on the cycle as the time passes from the initial disaster, and a lot of people aren't as stressed anymore. During COVID, it was amazing to see how organizations were able to rise to the challenges of the situation, including investing time, money, and effort to resolve the disaster as effectively as possible. Demobilization is in progress for many institutions, but mitigation efforts for the next pandemic, such as restocking and improving stuff, gathering staff, having supplies, and improving systems, may find the path forward hampered by the financial tolls COVID took on the organization. Nevertheless, effective leaders will help drive quality improvement forward. Just as in politics, all disasters are local. For example, a wildfire may lay claim to thousands of acres, but for any of the hospitals in the immediate threat area, the focus will be on the initial response. As the disaster progresses, many hospitals will likely use referral networks within their system to start getting aid to transferring patients out of the path of destruction. Over time, local emergency management and public health become involved, provided the municipality requests additional aid. If additional aid is needed that cannot be dealt with at the county or city level, organizations may reach out to healthcare coalitions before ultimately reaching out to the governor for a disaster declaration. Pretend the Yellowstone volcano erupts, affecting multiple states throughout the region. A more federal approach is needed, which requires authorization from the President of the United States to allow the FEMA to enact the National Incident Management System. That shows the higher up you go, the more time it takes and incredible amounts of executive fortitude you'll actually need. For clarity, the terms I've included here have quite a few acronyms, and these include OEM, PH, and EOC, which are defined for you below. That was a lot of stuff in a very short period of time, and hopefully you're still with me. But if not, let's kind of deep dive back into this so that I can explain each of these steps. The most familiar, of course, and the most practiced in any disaster system, and is usually the most eloquently coordinated, occurs between first responders and hospitals in the local area. Again, generally, most facilities will be able to respond to a disaster effectively when it is an acute, no-notice event, such as a multi-vehicle accident. But once a situation expands, such as a passenger train crash, local resources will likely be overwhelmed and will rapidly begin engaging their health systems for support, potentially transferring patients from the most affected hospital outward to more outlying partners. Let's focus on the roles of OEM and public health in the immediate vicinity first. So most who aren't familiar with emergency preparedness may not understand the role of the Office of Emergency Management for their city or county. In short, they are the logistics experts. Think of the train crash I just mentioned. This image, taken from an Outstander explainer video linked below, shows the mayor speaking to a bunch of different first responders who are all clamoring for help clearing the wreckage to get to the survivors. Most fire departments don't have large equipment to hoist train segments or perform very specialized search and rescue. The mayor can declare a disaster, and that small person on the right of the picture is the county's emergency manager. She's off to get that equipment ordered and delivered as soon as possible to help with operations. OEMs also provide financial and technical expertise, ranging from incident management teams to field operations. They are also essential for obtaining large or specialized equipment. Need to get a scene lit? they can get powerful outdoor lights. Need a bus to transport the walking wounded to leave the EMS rigs for more seriously injured patients. That's OEM in a nutshell. They provide logistical support. For hospitals, this can include needing snowplows during a blizzard or emergency generators during powerful storms. At least for this group, most of us are pretty knowledgeable about public health. Public health is responsible for augmenting the health, wellness, and treatment of individuals during a disaster. Their technical expertise ranges from providing consultation over possible persons under investigation, like with Ebola or Marburg, or in the case of a bioterror event, obtaining rapidly disseminated antibiotics, antidotes, or antivirals from pods that are guarded as part of the strategic national stockpile. Next, we'll sort of move up the chain. More time has passed, and we're going to start focusing in on what a healthcare coalition is. In essence, healthcare coalitions are geographic cohorts of public and private agencies that develop, respond, and prepare for disasters. They have many different contributors, including PSAPs, which are basically large dispatch centers, law enforcement, fire and rescue, hospitals, and local businesses, NGOs and charities such as the Red Cross. They also encompass guidance, which include the OEMs and public health. Unlike healthcare systems, the importance of an HCC is that it helps bring all the parties to the table to guide a response in a disaster. In Colorado, our state is divided into 9 different HCCs. We had a large fire here in Colorado just over a year ago, the Marshall Fire, a rapidly expanding urban firestorm that prompted large evacuations of people and nearly 3 hospitals in less than 4 hours. While large numbers of fire and rescue units responded in the area to find victims of the fires, the Colorado North Central HCC stood up to help with those efforts within an hour and provided much needed coordination over a broad geographic area from varying partners. Large events such as the Marshall Fire often require an even more robust emergency response. In that case, the governor declared a state of disaster area, which frees up funds for response and recovery, and includes providing even more specialized resources, such as disaster response teams with more training and expertise, and more experience managing large events. A state emergency operations center, or EOC, can be stood up to bring about the resources from other states or unaffected counties. Various EMACs, which you can think of are basically state-to-state mutual aid contracts, particularly where 2 states butt up against each other, are in place for large events. But as the complexity increases, it also takes more time for these EOCs to get the equipment or personnel into the area, which is why local responses and understanding the role of HCCs that can respond quicker to a situation is so important. Unfortunately, HCCs don't necessarily have the legal authority to compel responses or transfers. Thus, why a governor is so important for expanding incidents, because they do have the legal heft. The cavalry gets acted only from the President of the United States via FEMA. The governor informs the regional FEMA director, who works with POTUS to declare a national disaster, which begins the process of regional or national support. When a disaster gets that large, like Hurricane Katrina sized, the national response framework is a series of escalations necessary for a federal response. Part of this is the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. NIMS has 15 different support functions, or annexes, that represent federal responses to disasters. For those in healthcare, the annex called ESF 8 relates to public and medical health services, but note that there are other annexes to address all hazards, such as transportation, communications, public safety, etc. The NRM and NIMS are overseen by the director of HHS, and in the ongoing letter salad, the NRM and NIMS are activated after a request by ASPR. And none of this is particularly relevant, perhaps, to day-to-day operations. However, this slide communicates just how complicated things get as we move from local to more regional response. As part of the federal response, there are catchment areas that involve multiple states, known as FEMA regions. FEMA regions continue to refine how these regions get involved in emergency preparedness cycles, ranging from sharing of information to disaster training exercises. Increasing effort has been made to improve and expand on regional disaster health response systems, which clumsily are called RDHRS, of which today I am part of the Mountain Plains one for Region 8. The regional disaster health response systems within a region offer incredibly helpful coordination. One of the most fascinating challenges these systems often face is that states tend to be very insular in handling disasters, something that may be to the state's detriment. We recently did a disaster exercise, which showed that each state was very willing to take care of its own patients, but was very unwilling necessarily to use the broader region for its support. Nevertheless, the FEMA regions are the clearinghouses for the National Special Pathogen System and also medical countermeasures and biodefense. Here in Region 8, we are trying to go for a regional disaster EOC so that we can coordinate among the many states inside our region. Okay, that's a lot to take in. I've mentioned a ton of organizations, a lot of different word salad, multiple letters. And I know that that's a lot to process. So here are some midpoint take homes, just so you take the most important lessons right off the top. Even if you learn nothing else today, remember that no matter how an incident expands or contracts, all disasters require local management and effective emergency preparedness cycles. Hoping that the cavalry will just mosey on in when things get rough is not realistic, since it takes a long time to expand incidents for additional resources. Effective leaders will know not only their own organization's capabilities, but also appreciate how it integrates into the local OEM, HCC, and public health departments. But let's say you've decided it's time for your own disaster and you want to be effective in responding. Well, how do you do that? We're going to spend the remainder of the time talking about the Incident Command System, or ICS. So some of you may have heard of this and some of you may have not, but fortunately I have an explainer video that will allow you to understand exactly what emergency management is.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He's the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
EDS.
I'd like to thank EDS for their Super Bowl commercial. I don't know that they still exist, but it was worth every penny to talk about wrangling in short hairs. So that's sort of what ICS is. ICS is an outcropping from a number of horrible fires that occurred in California in the 1960s and 1970s. Here is a 1979 newspaper from San Diego showing the devastation that occurred when fires overtook more than 150,000 acres. These fires got out of control rapidly because agencies responding to the disaster were unable to coordinate, and part of this stemmed from different radio frequencies. They couldn't even talk to each other. Remember, this is before cell phones. But some of it came from having too many resources being sent to some parts of the fire, but none to others. Additionally, there was no common language used. Some departments, calling the exact same vehicle, had different names for their vehicles, such as sump truck, wildland pumper, or tankers. Without knowing what equipment was where, fire planners were unable to stop the disaster from spiraling out of control. At that time, the idea of ICS was found, and that we'll talk about much more in a minute. National adoption of ICS was brisk in the first response community, but became very important due to the events of 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. This prompted structuring of the national response framework, of which NIMS is a part. Specifically, ICS was recognized as the most important way to coordinate over every aspect of the disaster response because it is so adaptable and effective. But to show you why, I need to briefly throw a lot of words your way. And unfortunately, you will blank out. You will be unable to absorb the wall of text that's about to hit you. But I promise it'll be worth it. We'll dissect everything piecemeal. And here it is. Just bear with me as I read this, and we'll then talk about each part. ICS is the combination of facilities, equipment, personnel, procedures, and communications operating within a common organizational structure designed to aid in the management of resources during an incident response. I am sure 100% there was a committee that sat down to come up with all of those words in one sentence, and I'm really proud of them. It also, because that wasn't enough, defined another 8 portions of ICS, and they are unified command structure, modular organization, manageable span of control, common terminology, integrated communications, consolidated action plans, comprehensive resource management, and pre-designed incident facilities. That's a lot. But for the purposes of this particular talk, I'm really going to focus on those top 3 components only. The remainder require deeper dives into incident management, and I'll direct you where you can go to get that free training later on. Suffice to say that people need to understand incident command, but I'm going to make the argument that the top 3 components demonstrate why ICS is so essential in managing disasters. I'll also note that ICS isn't just for disasters. It can be used successfully for any large-scale event that requires interagency coordination. Denver hosted some of the games in the Stanley Cup in 2022, which, for the record, the Colorado Avalanche took that cup. But that required standing up an EOC to coordinate police, fire, rescue, city services, ambulances, and hospital response plans with involvement from our HCC. Nothing untoward occurred unless you were the Tampa Bay Lightning, in which case the Avalanche brought the beat down, go Avalanche, but the organizational structures were intact in case something did occur. Medicine rarely has difficulty with common terminology, but communications, action plans, resource management, and pre-designed incident facilities are less familiar to most, but critical to the emergency preparedness cycle. Healthcare uses ICS, but it also has its own ICS structure, which was also created incidentally and in parallel in California. And it's called HICS. Using the exact same principles of ICS for other organizations, HICS uses a unified command structure. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a predetermined but clear top-down hierarchy with very clear roles defined. We'll look at those rules next. But it's interesting quirk that individuals who fill in roles in HICS response may be placed in positions of authority and responsibility that are very different than normal operations. This is a big chart, but we'll go through each of it. We'll look at a case example in a moment that occurred literally just last week at my hospital. It couldn't have happened at a better time for me to talk about this particular system. But here is the key component of all HICS, the command and general staff. For all emergencies, an incident commander is placed in charge of an incident. Now, out in the field, that commander could be the first fire rescue arriving in a single car accident with no other aspects of the ICS chart activated. But for hospitals and large organizations, the incident commander will be in charge of the incident. Assisting the commander are core assistants, which are known as the command staff, which is the upper bracket. These command staff are all officers. They include the public information officer, safety officer, liaison officer. The public information officer handles internal and external communications. Safety officer ensures everything from chemical spills being properly contained to police protection in the event of an active shooter. The liaison officer communicates and coordinates with other response organizations or to keep the HCC or other organizations updated as to what is going on at that particular incident. The bottom line is that ICS is scalable with clear roles of who does what. This improves accountability of what is expected of all the members of the team, while remaining flexible enough for creative thinking to thrive. Now, the command staff can include an additional slot that's not pictured here, which includes a technical expert. For example, during COVID, infectious disease experts fulfilled this technical role, advising the incident commander directly. The commander is influenced and often directed by the chief executive, but not necessarily in how to run the disaster, but more ensuring compliance with legal responsibilities and capabilities that the institution can provide. Below that are the general staff, and they reflect the modular organization of ICS. In short, resources are organized by certain responsibilities. Unlike command staff, these positions may be activated only when needed. The most commonly activated section is the operations section because it is the tactical response arm of incident command. Planning works very closely with operations to help develop the objectives and overarching plan for responding. And planning is essentially what we call the strategy maker of ICS, while operations determines how to carry out those strategies. Logistics involves tracking and mobilizing other resources. In hospital disasters, this often reflects the need to organize an unbelievable number of volunteers who begin pouring into an organization when news of a disaster breaks. The least utilized, but perhaps one of the most important sections, is the finance chief. When disasters occur, reimbursement from the state or federal governments often requires accurate records of who did what and for how long, and also a track of all of those expenses incurred. Believe it or not, it is the case that if not everything is perfectly documented, funds that would go towards reimbursing those costs may never come to the organizations that are there. Again, that's a lot that we've covered so far. But the key here is that everything revolves around the commander and their direction on how to manage an incident. Each section has a role, but those roles should not overlap in order to maximize efficient command. Again, resources are organized by their responsibilities, which is very different than normal. So let's look at what happened at my hospital last week at around noon. Our phone system went out selectively, and this was a real world incident, so it's actually incredibly germane. And it may seem really benign, but it's got a lot to offer for this particular training. Our wireless Cisco phones could communicate with other wireless Cisco phones most of the time, and our desktop phones could communicate with other desktop phones, but neither the Cisco phones nor the desktop phones could talk to each other. And like I said, the Cisco phones were down intermittently. This was a big problem because it actually affected our emergency department's biophone, which allows communication with EMS and fire. Also, our emergency numbers for code blues and security were down. Therefore, the hospital elected to go on a code yellow. And so you know, for hospitals anyway, that is the universal distinction for a disaster in progress. Our org chart states that the incident commander is the nursing administrator on call. That role was not the chief nursing officer that day, but a different administrator. In an incident, however, the commander has the authority, not the C-suite. That is because in the hierarchy of HICS, it makes the commander the person who is in charge of the operation. While that commander has responsibilities to fulfill obligations, as I've mentioned, from the C-suite that may border on legal and other ramifications, or even ethical oversight, the preliminary response often is solely the purview of the incident commander. We'll circle back what an incident objective is on another slide, but our incident commander, with a little prompting, created a SMART objective that the general staff would need to come up with an alternative communications plan within 10 minutes. To that end, the operations chief began organizing all the house managers and nursing supervisors into a huddle on Microsoft Teams channel to issue orders. Those orders also went to the COO and the CMO to allow for broad-scale rollout of the plan and to ensure its execution. The planning chief began to refer to our own downtime phone plan and worked with operations to disseminate those plans. They then also began to figure out the highest priority phone issues for code blue and security issues, notwithstanding beginning planning for a short, medium, or long-lasting response so that all of our ducks were in a row. The logistics chief ensured that other wireless devices, which had been pre-placed on all the floors, were turned on and working properly for all the charge nurses. They also contacted IT to determine what things they may need for infrastructure, including whether cell boosters were necessary for personal cell phone use, or if they needed any specialized equipment ordered in to be replaced. Once all of the chiefs reported back to the commander, the public information officer drafted our internal and external communications, while our liaison officer informed our HCC, EOM for the county, and EMS partners about what was going on. So this is a real world example of how a command center can come together quickly, rapidly, and effectively and manage an incident using the unified command structure and its modular organization. Note that the roles remained separate and focused on their individual tasks. Frequently when problems arise, it's natural to attempt to work a problem like we do during normal business operations. But when a hazard arises, the focus invariably shifts to a command structure. This moves things away from what I like to call spitballing and debate into one of forward motion. In other words, nothing becomes more important to the hospital or any incident than carrying out the incident commander's objectives. And any debate is generally trumped by the incident commander. That doesn't mean discussions don't occur, but really this is a top-down procedure. That's what makes HICS an entirely action-oriented process. But for it to be successful, it is essential that people who are going to fulfill those roles drill repeatedly to learn how to carry out those actions. And for the leaders in the normal operation structure to become comfortable with ceding command to the HICS structure during emergencies. The last major principle of HICS that I'm going to comment on is the versatility known as a manageable span of control. In order to optimize what any one leader of the HICS org chart is managing, it is important that they are not overseeing too many staff. HICS works best when there's any leader supervising and managing only 3 to 7 subordinates, with the ideal number being around 5. What do I mean by subordinates, and how does that relate to scalability? Well, when an incident expands, such as with a hospital evacuation or for a hurricane, the number of moving parts can become overwhelming and thus must be broken into smaller, manageable parts. But before we expand, let's look at the simplest command structure. Let's say there's a major motor vehicle accident and 10 victims are en route to your hospital. Half of them are critically injured. This scenario at a large metropolitan hospital would likely cause a short-term surge into the ED and would affect the surgical, anesthesia, critical, and emergency department personnel. Given that this scenario is common, it is likely that all the affected staff are up to managing the incident, but may be experiencing higher victims than normal. So an ED physician would likely serve as the incident commander and to ensure that the ED absorbs those patients effectively and gets patients, the critical ones in particular, to the operating rooms as soon as possible. The incident commander no longer performs any patient care, but instead would likely designate the charge nurse as the operations section chief. And also that particular person would end up absorbing the other sections, the command staff. Since the incident commander has the idea of the priorities of the situation, they would create SMART objectives to facilitate the triage and distribution of patients. The operations chief, in this case, the charge nurse, would work out where in the ED the patients will go. That's a planning function, for example, and which nurses will be responsible for staffing those units. That's logistics. They will reinforce already established protocols for responding to an incident, which includes other logistics like having the appropriate services paged to the emergency department. The incident itself does not require the whole hospital to stand up a disaster response, so the command staff are consolidated into the charge nurse alone. The charge nurse may create individual branch directors that manage different zones in the emergency department, for example, so that they don't have to get into the weeds. The branch directors would ensure the staff under them are fulfilling their roles as each of these patients arrive. But let's say that instead of a motor vehicle accident, we're talking about a train derailment with chlorine gas release near a neighborhood that's part of a major metropolitan area. That would warrant things to move far beyond just an ED response. Here's a rather expanded HICS org chart. Note that we still see the usual 4 sections, from our prior slide, which include logistics, planning, finance, and operations. But due to the scope of the response, those chiefs need to supervise several subordinates who themselves will be supervising others. Let's start looking at the logistics chief first. Note that underneath the logistics section, the chief is supervising 6 subordinates that have very important functions. These include communications, transportation, material support, nutritional supplies, IT, and facilities. The facilities unit leader supervises two additional individuals, the damage assessment and control officer and the sanitation and systems control officer. It's critical that those unit leaders that I just mentioned, the officers, provide information up the chain of command to the logistics chief, who can guide each of them to fulfill the will of the incident commander. But the logistics chief does not supervise the facilities unit leader's subordinates, because that would be too many individuals to supervise, a total of 8. So a sub-branch was created and management was placed under the facilities unit leader. I need to pause momentarily because you may have noticed I'm using terms like chief or officer or unit leader. These are part of the standardized nomenclature of HICS, which allows for seamless understanding of each person's role and rank in the org chart. They're not important to explain here because they do get complicated. They are pivotal for the proper function of HICS. Let's look now at the operations chief. You'll notice that this chief's span of control is only 3 subordinates in this case. That's considered a lower number, less than ideal sometimes, but that's made up for in the sheer complexity. The chief is managing all of those branches underneath them. Note that each director underneath the operations chief has multiple subordinates under them, and some have even further subordinates. The goal here is to maintain a span of control. The decision to appoint additional leaders depends upon the incident, but conversely, the goal to collapse positions is the function of planning for demobilization. It looks very complex from the outside and is made a lot more complex if individuals do not stay focused on their specified roles. But when people rise to the challenge, the HICS system is unparalleled for breaking a disaster into manageable chunks to be solved in a rapid fashion. As disasters expand in complexity to the state and federal level, it is critical to get the overall response managed. Specialized teams with advanced training help establish emergency operations centers. These centers help coordinate multiple different commanders under one overall lead called the area command. For example, in the train with chlorine gas scenario, there would likely be an area command overseeing a fire and hazmat command, a county level EOC incident command, various hospitals HICS commands, police command, etc. But as always, responses remain local, which is why it is so important to have a robust incident command system in place. Now, I realize not all of us are DRACs, and it's very possible that some of this went over your head, and that's not too surprising, because the reality is that a fully flexed area command is exceptionally complex. But the good news is that the whole area command is broken down into modular spans of control, which makes running the show easier. So let's see how that works in action when we talk a little bit more about how we carry out objectives during a disaster. And so this explainer video gives you a little insight.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
I'd like to thank Berlitz for that, because knowing exactly what the incident commander is thinking about is extraordinarily important. The success of any incident depends upon taking a complex problem and breaking it up into individual components into solvable objectives. The incident commander is responsible for creating those objectives, and they begin from the very moment of the disaster. The usual process is to have objectives that use SMART as their acronym, so that operations and planning chiefs can establish effective strategies and tactics to address those objectives. Let's look back at the phone outage from our hospital last week. This was the original incident objective: need to establish alternative communications plan for internal and external partners in the next 10 minutes. So it was very specific. And one of the things about being specific is that it does not need to explain how that is going to occur, merely that it is specific. Planning's job is to make sure that they understand how to carry that out. It was measurable because in an active communications plan for internal and external partners, it was achievable because we have downtime plans. It was realistic for the same reason, and it was time limited in the next 10 minutes. This is simple, but not easy, and is a good way to think of incident objectives. Many incident commanders struggle with trying to solve everything by themselves by knowing everything. But ICS says no one person needs to know everything. Its modular design allows individuals to focus on specific tasks to achieve those objectives. This is where it can be difficult sometimes when we have C-suite members inside the incident command center. Because of their institutional knowledge, they want to try to command every aspect of the disaster. But the benefit of the modular organization allows a groupthink to occur under the command of one individual. So the commander didn't need to know the downtime communications plan, nor did she need to know how to distribute that information. Each of those roles is fulfilled under ICS. It's not the most intuitive system at first blush, but with practice, it begins to click. And that is where we talk about further training. So training is key, and the barrier for entry is exquisitely low. In addition to this being a free video you've just watched, the Department of Homeland Security provides training for free, both online and in person. In the online portion, there is the most basic and fundamental, which kind of gives you an introduction to ICS called ICS 100. And it allows you to sort of understand the structure in a little bit more depth than I necessarily presented today. ICS 200 talks about basic incident command. In other words, how do we do what we do? And I hinted on that at some of the later slides. ICS 800 explains sort of how the National Response Framework supports broad-scale responses to big disasters, such as what we would deal with in FEMA Region 8 as part of the Mountain Plains Regional Disaster Health Response System. ICS 300, which I cannot recommend enough, is an in-person course that goes over 2 days, and it deals with expanding incidents. One of the coolest parts about this is very frequently people will work with individuals they normally wouldn't work with in a day-to-day process. For example, during my ICS 300, I dealt with a search and rescue team, I dealt with a fire chief, 2 different police detectives, and also other healthcare personnel. And that is very much what happens in large disasters, is this interface that occurs. Now imagine for a moment that for the training, we all understood the language we were trying to communicate and how we would coordinate during disasters. It is absolutely free and it is absolutely worth it. For those who really want to dive in deep, and I cannot recommend this enough, Anniston, Alabama has the Center for Domestic Preparedness. And the coolest thing about this is this particular center, which is run by FEMA, basically will feed you, pay for all of your travel and lodging, and have you come on down for training as well. There's one in particular that I recommend, which is Healthcare Leadership for Mass Casualty Incidents. It's a 5-day course. And if you're interested, talk to your emergency manager to try and find out how you can take that course. Again, everything except your own pay, of course, is covered. And so it's really worth that particular journey. So I'm going to bring it all home here. Emergency preparedness is essential to addressing emergencies, but practice is critical. As you can see from most of my slides, this is not something you can just whip up without any pre-knowledge. You have to drill, and many organizations fail when it comes to responding to disaster because they don't drill adequately. And unfortunately, that circles back to the fact that all disasters are local, so preparation is needed locally, as the cavalry may be a long way off. And when the cavalry does get involved, it doesn't make it easier. You have to continue with your own local response and coordinate it with a larger response. HICS operations can be expanded or contracted to any incident, and highly recommend that all healthcare providers are aware of HICS because it actually impacts how we deliver care during disasters. And disasters do occur, not if they occur, they will. Be smart, use the SMART objectives, and thrive. By the way, I found that the SMART objectives are wonderful when you're supervising your children cleaning their rooms. Try it and be smart, and you'll also find it works great for disasters as well. So that's all I have today. And again, I want to thank the Region 8 Mountain Plains Regional Disaster Health Response System for allowing me to be a part and for allowing me to share this information with you today. For more information, we'll include some links associated with this, and I hope the rest of you have a wonderful day.